As you can see, there's a little coal thing up there. And partially that's because I love fire, and we were just out in the woods this past week a little bit, and it was a lot of fun. I got to build fire, so I like fire. But the reality is that it's going to represent something for us as we continue on in our study this morning. If you remember back to about a month ago, we looked at Matthew chapter 6, and we looked at verses 25 through 27, where Jesus talks about, do not worry for your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. And we looked at that, and we recognized something with it. When it talks about our physical life, do we have anything to worry about? No. And what point was Jesus making? He was making the point there, as we looked at a few weeks ago, that when you worry about your physical life, you begin to forget about your spiritual life. Well, this morning, as we talked about not worrying, this morning, now we're going to flip the page a little bit. I'm going to talk about worrying. And the reason is because we do need to worry about certain things in our life. When we see Jesus talking about not worrying, what we never see him say is don't worry about your spiritual life. We never see him say that. We never see him show any sign of that throughout the Bible. See, when we look at this, what we really find is that there is a necessity to us worrying. There is importance when it comes to us worrying about certain things. I'm going to ask you to turn over to 1 Peter chapter 1 here in just a moment. But you see, the reason it's so important for us to worry about our spiritual life is because something happened to me not this past week, but the week before. I was riding around with somebody. We were picking up ammo stuff for one of the jets. And as we were, he asked me this question. And the question he asked really doesn't matter, but how he started it does. He said this. He said, Jason, he called me White, but that's because that's my last name. He said, taking religion out of your answer, taking religion out of the reason why you believe this, can you tell me why? And then he proceeded with actually a few questions, all of which greatly influenced, for me, by what I believe the Bible teaches. And as he asked that question, I began to think about certain things. I began to think about, why are we trying to take religion? Why are we trying to take God out of our answers? The reality of it is that when we talk to the world or we talk to others, they're going to have this statement, and they're going to say, this is a God-forsaken world. And I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to say that phrase again because it makes me angry. It makes me incredibly angry to hear anybody ever say that, because the reality of it is that we don't. We don't live in that type of world, but the type of world that we are living in is a world that has forsaken God. We see this so much, and we so recognize or so shown by this one phrase that he said, take religion out of it. And then I started thinking about these types of things. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 1. What does the Bible teach us about our worrying? For some reason, my slide wasn't wanting to hit the right area. What does it teach us? Turn over 1 Peter chapter 1, reading in verses 13. We're beginning in verse 13. It says, therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lust as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ as a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him we believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. He says there in verse 13, gird up the loins of your mind. What does that do? It tells you to prepare. It's telling you to make sure that your mind is sober. Make sure your mind is ready. But you know what I found really interesting? If you skip down to verse 17 with me. And he says, and if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear. You know, we think too often, or we see too often, people just go around doing whatever we feel like doing. And you know what we really see is that there's no fear of God. There's no reverence towards God. There's no worry about our spiritual life. I think partially that's because we're taking it out of everything. We're acting as if we don't have one anymore. And that is incredibly sad. But you know, this worry, this fear, because let's face it, when we're afraid of something, we're worried about it, aren't we? If we're afraid of God and afraid of what's going to happen, we're going to talk about that a little bit later this morning. We're going to be worried about our spiritual life. Turn over to Luke, the first chapter, verse 12. And Luke, the first chapter, verse 12 says, and when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. Who did he see? He saw an angel of the Lord. He saw him, and he was afraid. Doesn't that tell us something about God? When an angel of the Lord will make him afraid, and yet we have the whole Bible, that we should be able to allow it to make us worry. Make us worry for our spiritual life. And when we talk about this, when we talk about this type of fear, turning over to Luke chapter 5 and verse 26, it says, and they were amazed, and they glorified God, and were filled with fear, saying, we have seen strange things today. Fear is not a bad thing. I'm hoping that's very clear this morning. This worry, this fear is not a bad thing for us to have. It's an important thing. It's a good thing for us to have when we're talking about our soul, when we're talking about our salvation. But turn over to Acts chapter 2 and verse 40 through 43. Here we have, right after the speaking of the apostles. And what it says, and with many other words he testified and exhorted them, saying, be saved from this perverse generation. Then those who gladly received his word were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done throughout the apostles. Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all, as anyone had need. They were amazed at these things, but what happened? They were still afraid. There was still fear that came upon them. The reality of it is when we talk about this, we have to recognize religion can't be the only reason. That's what the world wants us to think. They want us to think that we have to have some other reason to say what we say, some other logical reason, which, let's face it, religion, incredibly logical. But they want some other reason. But religion is always the best reason. It really is. Let's face having this fear, this is going to keep us from forsaking God. God won't forsake us, but we can forsake him. But if we have this worry about our soul, we aren't going to be forsaking it. We're going to continue to look towards him, continue to go towards him. But lastly, what I want to make mention is that glorifying God and fearing God, they're not separate. They go hand in hand. I have a fear and a reverence towards God, but you know what? I also want to glorify him every single chance I have. Those two things, they're not going to have one without having the other, are you? They have to coexist. They do. All right, we understand that there is a necessity to us worrying about our spiritual soul, our spiritual life. We've talked about that it's a good thing for us to have this, but we're going to look a little bit deeper into that. Turn over to Lamentations, the 3rd chapter. Lamentations, the 3rd chapter, the writer here says in verse 37 through 42, I believe is where we're actually going to be reading through. Says, "Who is he who speaks, and it comes to pass when the Lord has not commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that woe and well-being proceed? Why should a living man complain, and a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search out and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled. You have not pardoned." Why is the writer actually writing this right now? Because when you look in chapter 2, what you see is a lot of complaining going on. A lot of complaining because of the consequences. A lot of complaining for what has happened to them. Look what's going on today. How often do we see everybody complaining? How often do we see ourselves complaining? Complaining isn't something that's just going to go away, but it's something that's going to replace us looking at ourselves. Us taking that, instead of complaining about these things, let's turn it around. Let's examine ourselves. That's what the writer here is telling them to do. When you look there in verse 40. He says, "Let us search out and examine our ways," and what? "And turn back to the Lord." He doesn't want them to go on, continue complaining about these things, but rather look back, examine your life, and say, okay, this is what I need to do now. This is how I need to turn back to the Lord. Let's look at the parable of the lost son. We're not going to read the entire parable, but we remember it. The younger son went to his father. He asked him for his inheritance. He went off and he squandered it. But what ended up happening after that? If we begin reading in verse 17 first, it says, "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger?'" He recognizing something that happened in his life. He recognized that he messed up, didn't he? He sees that he messed up, and now he's saying, my father's hired servants, they have enough bread and they have enough to spare. So what does he do? Does he let his pride build up and continue to complain and continue to throw fits? No. Read with me in verse 21. He goes back. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son." He went back humbly to his father. Could he have done that if he hadn't been able to examine his life? Could he have been able to go back and recognize that he messed up, recognize that he sinned to his father and to God, and make things right if he hadn't recognized he had messed up to begin with? No. It's healthy for us to worry, because when we do, it's going to help us to examine our life. It's going to help us to look back on our lives. And I think that's something that we don't really do enough anymore. Take time out of our days to look at it and say, how has my day been today? Has my day been a day in which my light has shown that the world has seen a Christian? Or have I tried to hide that and fit in with the rest of the world? Because we do that sometimes. We try to fit in with everybody else because we want to be socially accepted. Why? I'm not sure, but I know I've done it. But that's exactly what we need to be able to do. Look at our lives. Examine our lives. Because when we're able to recognize, when we look over in Romans 3:23, and it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We know that verse, don't we? But do we really know that verse? Do we really know that we have fallen short and that I need to take the opportunity to recognize my shortcomings to make things right with God? What about 1 John chapter 3, verse 8? It says, "He who sins is of the devil. For the devil has sinned, and from the beginning, for this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil." Do we remember and recognize that when we are sinning, that it's not just, oh, okay, but it's a work from the devil, the one who's been sinning since the beginning? Is that what we want? Or do we want to recognize, I don't need that anymore in my life? So let's examine my life. Let's continue looking at my life. In 2 Corinthians, the 13th chapter and verse 5. Paul writing to the church at Corinth here, we're going to go up a little bit because I think it's going to make a lot of sense. But read here in verse 5 with me to begin with. It says, examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourself. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you? Let's ask the question, why is Paul telling them this? We use this verse a lot. We recognize we need to examine ourselves. We need to test ourselves and see if we're in the faith. But why is Paul telling them this? Turn with me up to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Let's read in verse 20 and 21. Paul writes and he says, for I fear lest when I come, I shall not find you such as I wish, and that I shall be found by you such as you do not wish. Stop there. He's worried that he's going to find them in a condition that he doesn't want to find them in. But he goes further than that, and it's not just that he's going to find them in a condition that he doesn't want to find them in. He's worried that he's going to find them in a condition that they don't want to be found in. Doesn't this kind of make a lot of sense as to why we need to examine ourselves? Well, let's continue. He says, lest there be contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, backbiting, whisperings, conceit, tumults, lest when I come again my God will humble me among you, and I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented of the uncleanness, fornication, and lewdness, which they have practiced. Paul's writing here and he's saying, I'm going to come back to you. He says, I'm writing to you right now, but I'm going to come back, and I hope that I don't find you in this. But what does he do? He doesn't just leave it at that. He gives them some great advice. And that's what he tells them in verse 5. He says, examine yourself. Test yourself as to whether you're in the faith. But what's really interesting is when you continue on there. It says, do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you are disqualified? But I trust that you will know that we are not disqualified. We have the authority to examine ourselves. And you know why? Because we know what to examine ourselves against. We don't sit here and worry about our soul for no reason and say, okay, well, I'm better than John Doe, so I think I'm okay. We don't sit here and say, well, I've done a little bit more than him in good time. I think I'll be... No. We have this one standard that gives us the authority, that gives us the way in order to examine ourselves. And that's what we need to use. That's why we are able to examine ourselves, because it's not just random. It's not just... does Jason think he's a good person? That's not at all what we're looking at ourselves against. But if we do and we sit down and we examine ourselves, let's ask ourselves this question. How will I be found? How am I going to be found one day? Am I going to be found that which is righteous or that which is not? Ignore the one typo because I recognize it, and again, I forgot about it. Matthew chapter 16, verse 27. Says, for the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he'll reward each according to his works. Examine our works and see if they are in line with the will of God. Because that's what we need to be doing. But this is going to be our last slide for this morning. Because when we look and we start examining ourselves, what we need to realize is we have two choices in life, don't we? Nobody would disagree. We have two choices ultimately. You can have a short time when you're worrying about your soul and you're worrying about all of these things. Or You can go on living the life that we feel like living, and then we're going to spend eternity in torment. Those are choices. Worry for a short time, eternally tormented. One sounds a little bit better to me than the other, doesn't it? We see this when we turn over to Matthew, the 7th chapter, and verse 13. And Jesus is speaking here, and he says, "Enter by the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." We can go down the narrow gate or we can go down the wide, but that narrow gate means that we're going to be worrying about stepping off that edge all the time. But if we're worried about it, that's a good thing, because it's going to help keep us going straight. Turn with me over to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 10. We're going to close this morning by looking at hell. I think it's something that I know I don't really look at enough. But I think it's something we need to look at more. There's a reason we're told about it, isn't there? Some of that reason should cause a little bit of worry in us. Turn over to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 10. It says, "The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." We can talk about this torment, and there's things that we think that they're tormenting us, don't we? We've all talked, or I've talked about, I have some anxiety issues sometimes. I feel like it's tormenting me, but eventually it goes away. This torment that we're going to be looking at, it's not one that's going to go away. Turn over to Matthew chapter 25, verse 30. Jesus talking about the unprofitable servant. We see that parable. But here in verse 30 it says, "And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." I remember Mike had a lesson not too long ago, and he talked about darkness, and he talked about being down in this cave, and they turned off all the lights, and you couldn't see your hand right in front of your face. You know what? Does that make us a little bit fearful? What about the thought where we're going to be cast into a place of darkness that's going to be incredibly dark, and there's nothing we can do about it? They're able to turn the lights back on in that cave, but that darkness won't go away. And you know why it's going to be so dark? As I was looking at this, I started thinking, God is light and Him is no darkness. And when you're no longer in the presence of God, you're no longer near God at all, you're cut off completely, there's no more light. Turn over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. It says, "These shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His power." Right now, in this life, we sin. But we have an opportunity that we can pray and we can ask for forgiveness and no longer be separated from God. And that's a good thing, because that's that worry that tells us we need to do something. But one day that's not going to be there, and that separation won't just be for a short time. But it'll be for eternity. Turn over to Luke chapter 16, verse 23. Luke 16, verses 23 and 24. I talked about the fact I like fire. By the way, I learned Leanne likes fire too, so that makes me happy, Dad. But as I'm looking at this fire, I think about what it's able to do. And kids, when they touch something hot, or Logan was throwing wood onto the fire, that was a good time too. But as he would get close and be like, because it got hot. There was a little bit of pain, a little bit of torment that was there. In Luke chapter 16, verse 23 and 24, it says, "And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. Then he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame." He was in so much torment because of this flame that he just wanted his tongue cooled just a little bit. And it's not going to happen. But as much as we like to think that we know what it's like to have for this everlasting fire, right? We like to think that we can really comprehend this topic. When we think about a fire, we think about something that consumes. I said Logan had to throw more logs on the fire, and I say had to, I really mean he got to because he was just having fun with it. But he had to keep doing it because that fire kept burning him up. This everlasting fire, we will not be consumed. We will be tormented forever by it. Does that thought cause some fear to sink into us? It should. Like I said, sometimes we don't completely understand that thought, do we? Over Matthew, the 25th chapter, in verses 31 through 36, or 31 through 46. This is talking about when Jesus is going to come back. And it says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from his goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. And the king will say to those on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or feed you, or thirsty, and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger, and take you in, or naked, and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick, or in prison, and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Then he will also say to those on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick, and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they will also answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. We have two choices. And the choices we have is that we get to be a sheep, and that term's been used very negatively lately. All over Facebook, all over social medias, we see this term, we see people saying, stop being a sheep. Well, guess what? I'm proud to be a sheep. I want to be a sheep because I know I have the best shepherd ever. You know, we can be a sheep or we can be a goat. We can be on the right hand or the left. But ultimately what that means is that we get to hear this. Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. Or we will hear, Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. That's our options. That's what we get to choose. I hope that we all want to spend just a short time of our life worrying. I hope that's what we want to do, because there's something so much worse coming.